Welcome to Virtual Sentiments. I'm your host, Kristen Collins. Today's episode marks the premiere of our third season. I can't wait to share with you a conversation that I recorded in August 2024 with Kris Rose, who is a governance director at Meta. At Meta, Kris works across the company to drive thought on emerging trends at the intersection of technology, society, and governance. He also leads the team's community governance work, including community forums and other pilots focused on empowering user voice in the company's decision-making. Kris also works with third-party partners, independent from Meta, which include the Oversight Board, Stanford University's Deliberative Democracy Lab, and the Behavioral Insights team. Later in the season, we'll have an episode with Dr. Alice Hsu, an associate director at Stanford's Deliberative Democracy Lab, to get her expertise on digital politics, as well as her perspective on the very same community forums that we'll be discussing in this episode. This is our first time doing an episode talking to a representative from a frankly giant company that is in the news a lot. So there's a few things that I want to mention before we dive in. First, I want to be open with you that my partner works at Meta, albeit within a different team than Kris's. I am not privy to any information that isn't publicly available, and I think I can maintain my own independent judgment on these topics. But this way you can question whether I exhibit any bias. Second, if you're listening to this podcast, you've probably heard that on January 7th, Mark Zuckerberg announced major policy changes at Meta. These included replacing third-party fact-checkers with a user-directed moderation system, at least in the US for now, changing what kind of speech might be deemed harmful or not, and promoting more political content on their platforms. After reviewing our recording and following up with Kris and his colleagues, I only found one detail that seemed contradicted by this recent news. So rather than edit it out, I wanted to note here that early in the conversation, Kris refers to his team being nested under Global Affairs at Meta, with Nick Clegg serving as the president of Global Affairs. However, now Joel Kaplan is the president of Global Affairs at Meta. I decided to leave that one outdated detail in the episode because I think it's a good thing that it dates the conversation and allows us to know that it occurred before this year. If there are any further changes at Meta, it will be easier for listeners to know that this conversation happened in a specific window of time. I like to think of this conversation with Kris as a small, really informal case study of how one team within one company is trying to tackle the thorny political and ethical issues posed by technological advancements, like generative AI, by seeking the public's perspectives. As evident in this episode, I think it's really cool that a private company would work with third parties to get users' feedback, when otherwise they might more heavily rely on information from clients like digital advertisers. But I think that if an institution, whether we're talking about a private company or the government, wants to exhibit a true commitment to creating trust and legitimacy in the eyes of the public, that process will often require more than just soliciting feedback, but creating structures through which that feedback can be seen as influencing decision-making. I'll return to some of my thoughts on that from a political theory perspective at the end of the episode. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed listening to this conversation with Kris as much as I enjoyed talking to him. Today on Virtual Sentiments, we have the pleasure of speaking to Kris Rose. He is a governance director at Meta, where he works across the company to drive thought on emerging trends at the intersection of technology, society, and governance. He also leads the team's community governance work, including community forums and other pilots focused on empowering user voice in the company's decision-making. Prior to this role, Kris helped launch the company's Oversight Board, served as a geopolitical analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency for a decade, to include a secondment as a brief on the president's daily brief, and most recently served as a senior advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Kris holds a master's in public policy from Georgetown University and is a term member with the Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks so much for joining us, Kris.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Kristen.
I'm so excited to talk with you. We've talked about a lot of different issues on this podcast: misinformation, artificial intelligence or large language models, and also policy more broadly, and the way that social media platforms might be designed, or also the way that government actors might think about designing policies on their end for affecting all sorts of issues relating to digital privacy and all these varying kind of dynamics of politics online. And so, what I'm really excited to talk to you about is the work that you're doing uniquely at Meta and thinking about governance while also contextualizing your work at Meta with the industry as a whole. So, I know that your expertise goes beyond just your experiences at Meta, and that's really important. And then also, you can kind of help give us a zero in on what you know firsthand, and also kind of how you and your team approach the topics you're approaching in light of what other organizations are doing, because these are sort of live, hot, always changing topics and issues. So thanks for agreeing to talk about this very kind of wide ranging and dynamic area.
I'm super excited to be here, and the reality is that with technology, the environment is always changing, and so is the policy landscape, how platforms operate, but indeed how decisions are made. And so I'm super excited to unpack it with you.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So, why don't we start just by focusing on what exactly it is that you do and what does the kind of larger meta governance team do? Kind of give us a little window into what your day to day life is like.
Totally. So, as you note, I come from the governance organization within Meta, and we're a team that is nested within the global affairs, the broader global affairs organization, under Nick Clegg, the president for global affairs. And our focus really is about how power is distributed between the company and users, and how decisions are made at the company vis-a-vis its relationship with users. So we obviously have, as you noted, and some of your guests have previously discussed, in tech companies, you have a range of different experts that are making the policies around what is allowed online on social media platforms, or how their AI products should operate. And you also have public policy officials that have experience in government and are working with governments on regulation. Our focus really is about empowering users to have a greater say in the decision making at the company. And so our background is really rooted in something that Mark Zuckerberg said in 2018, which was that he didn't believe that companies alone should have such a big impact on issues regarding free speech. This was at the height of some of the contention around what platforms call content moderation, but basically the rules about what is allowed online. And Mark in 2018 said that he didn't think that platforms should be making decisions that had such an outsized impact on society, particularly at the scale that at the time Facebook had across billions of users, particularly when platforms like Facebook are, in some instances, some of the few ways that people have access to information. And so there was obviously this arc of time where people were starting to congregate on social media, and no one necessarily knew how the story of social media would unfold. But as people started to post their family photos or about their lives and share more about themselves on these platforms, we also saw different forms of abuse start to pile up, whether it was hate speech or exploitation or terrorism, et cetera. And so as we scaled our content moderation operation, there's also this question about these very, very significant calls, these what we call significant and difficult calls, issues that are at the heart of society, or they're highly contested, or they may have a big impact off platform. And so Mark commissioned the establishment of something that he called at the time a Supreme Court for Facebook. Our team designed and operationalized what is now known as the Oversight Board, which is this independent organization that has binding authority over the company. So if you are on one of our platforms today, for the first time ever, you can appeal to an external body that has binding authority over Meta on significant and difficult pieces of content and decisions that the company's made. I share that only to say that that's really kind of at the heart of what our team does, and everything that we do. We're looking to evaluate the systems and the power dynamics between users and the company, and empower users to have a greater say over the company.
That's excellent. And let's just sort of, I do want to make sure listeners understand the relationship then between your team and the Oversight Board, because as you emphasize there, the Oversight Board is an external body and it has binding effect on Facebook. So what exactly, like, can you just clarify further what that relationship is like? And then how does their decisions affect what you do at Meta?
Yeah, great question. And we get it a lot. So happy to unpack it, and if any of happy to dive deeper into any other element as well. But when we first designed the oversight board, we designed it to be independent, and to have independent decision making authority over the company. And so there's an arrangement between the company and the board, where the board has its own staff, its own members, and we fund the oversight board through an irrevocable trust. So we fund a trust that Meta cannot access after we fund the trust, and the trust oversees the funds for the oversight board, and the board has its own administration, as well as it obviously now appoints its members for who will serve on the board.
And so, from the user perspective, what's I think very interesting about this, just kind of bring in a little bit of my political theory background, is that it's this process. It's an appeals process in a way, right? If there's a decision, if my post is taken down, and I think it was wrong for it to be taken down, it was still within the policies, content moderation policies, I can appeal to the oversight board, almost in the way that you'd be seeking some sort of due process rights in our American judicial system. Is that correct?
That's right. And that's the second part of your question about kind of what is the relationship. So it's an independent organization, but we have enshrined it through governance documents that are published and publicly available, but that we have committed to implementing the board's decisions unless they break law. And so we have provided it this binding authority on specific pieces of content. But what's also really exciting is that the oversight board has the ability to also, in any of its decisions, append non-binding recommendations. And so that's another way that the board can influence Meta's approach over time, where they can share that, they obviously have a specific decision about it, for example, your piece of content, but they can also offer broader guidance to us that we have committed, not necessarily to implement, but to at least considering and to publicly responding to. I think it points to some of the kind of key features and tenets of anything that our team does, which is we really think about the legitimacy of these organizations and the enduring nature of them when we're designing them. And so we think of things like representativeness, independence, whether or not it's an informed process, whether or not there's transparency to any process, and whether it's consistent. And so we've set out, at least for the oversight board, but indeed in some of these other governance mechanisms that we have developed, we strive to have each of those core tenets as a part of each of these mechanisms.
That's great. And let's dig into those too. So I really am excited that we'll talk more about the community forums. So what are these community forums? How has your team and have you been working with all sorts of stakeholders and also your partners like the Stanford Deliberative Democracy Lab, and thinking about, again, how you develop these processes and procedures that allow you to fulfill that mission that you described, this idea of studying, understanding, kind of rebalancing the power between users and the company, if I'm hopefully putting it the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been really excited about this next governance innovation that we've developed over the past couple of years. And I would just note at the outset that we have that this has been a really inclusive process, and that we wouldn't be anywhere where we are today in terms of how excited we are, and indeed a lot of the value and impact that we're seeing on Meta's decision making, if it hadn't been for a broad range of stakeholders. As you mentioned, Stanford's Deliberative Democracy Lab, which is a key partner to us, the Behavioral Insights team out of the UK, which was also helped us scope and design these forums, but indeed other leading deliberative democracy experts, practitioners, and academics and theorists who have advised us and continually give us feedback, because we know that the story of governance is never fully written, and so we want to continue to innovate further. But in terms of how it all began, right when we launched the Oversight Board in 2020, so Mark first discussed the Oversight Board in concept in 2018, and then we spent the following 2 years designing and operationalizing the board. It launched and started to receive cases in late 2020, so it's just about 4 years old. And around that time, we started to ask ourselves, what might it look like to bring users closer to Meta's decision making? What are new avenues where we can do that, particularly earlier in the innovation cycle? So, what is so exciting about the Oversight Board is that it's a form of external accountability, where this body of experts outside the company can hear directly from users who feel aggrieved by a decision that we've made. But we also know that Meta is stepping into new types of innovation. There's always new types of questions that aren't necessarily about decisions that we've already made, but indeed are about decisions we're going to be making. And so the question was, how might we work and develop a new process by which users can advise us on that? And so in doing so, we started to study deliberative democracy, which is this really inspiring and powerful mode of democracy or model of democracy that is taking root. The OECD has called it the so-called deliberative wave. But as people start to question whether or not their representatives are actually representing them in legislatures, or whether or not they feel fully represented in by their elected officials, what we've seen in the public sector, right? So this is not at Meta, but in the public sector, is this really rich ecosystem of deliberative democracy taking root in the form of things like citizens' assemblies or mini publics, where representative samples of the public are commissioned by governments to advise them on really thorny, sticky, sometimes polarizing, sometimes really contentious policy issues. And so we started to study this, and what we saw was what the academic literature is saying is that this has real power and real potential, and something that we thought we could outfit for the first time ever into a corporate setting. And so what we saw was that these mini publics, when they're successful, are able to drive consensus on really thorny issues. They're able to provide rich, considered feedback for governments and governing institutions. And they're able to take out some of the sensationalism around policy issues, because they're rooted in this deliberative approach that has features such as education, access to expertise, as well as respectful dialogue. And so we started to study that, and that is really what is the basis for our community forums. And we continue to consult experts and receive feedback, and ultimately have landed on this community forum approach, in which we partner with Stanford's Deliberative Democracy Lab to bring this type of deliberative approach to some of the questions that Meta is grappling with in our innovation.
Great, great. No, that is so let's dig into the process of the community forum itself. So like you were saying, the deliberative aspect to it is both in terms of, or gets divided into, you have experts and you have information that participants are shown, but then also the participants are discussing with each other a myriad of different kind of issues, these dilemmas that companies are facing today, that individuals are facing today. So do you want to kind of give us kind of operationalize this for us? Like, what's an example of one of the topic areas that you guys have had one of these forums on?
Yeah, we started piloting the forums in 2022, and it's taken a couple different manifestations. But the current model that we operate under is, again, this partnership with Stanford's Deliberative Democracy Lab, which Jim Fishkin has been a pioneer in deliberative polling for decades, and we're so thrilled to work with them for a couple reasons. One is the expertise that they bring to the field. Second is that they have a proprietary platform that enables deliberation at scale. And so a tech company like Meta, what we're so excited about is, given our user base, we want to be able to operate at scale across many different regions all at once. And a lot of existing citizens assembly models or deliberative democracy levels or models operate in person. And so we would like to see technology be a part of the solution. And Stanford has developed this proprietary platform. But then also, we think it's really important to partner with an external body. We know that an external independent body, because we know that we want to ensure that this is seen and is an independent process. So the way that it works is that we, as you know, we identify an issue where we think in some time Meta may need to be making a decision about innovation. So most recently, we've really been, like much of the world, focused on generative AI. And so we know that there is a lot of promise to generative AI, but there's a lot of concern, apprehension, and indeed peril to generative AI as well. And so we recognize the need to involve the public as a part of that design process. And so in June of 2023, we announced that we were going to hold a community forum on the principles people think should underpin generative AI technologies. And indeed, we're excited. We ran a forum in 4 countries in October of 2023, and we're excited that we're expanding that into new regions this fall in October 2024. But the way that it works, to get to your question, is that we develop education materials. So the kind of key tenets of the deliberative process are education, access to expertise, and then facilitated deliberation. We develop in partnership with Stanford's Deliberative Democracy Lab, and indeed the Behavioral Insights team, who we've worked with previously. We develop education material to identify kind of foundational background information for a topic. So this is really background context that people need to understand to have a conversational fluency about a topic at hand. We also then share with them some of the competing trade-offs and the complexities dealing with these issues. So, for example, in AI, we might provide foundational information about how AI models are trained, what machine learning actually is, and try to make it as accessible as possible for people who are non-experts. We also involve a external advisory group of third-party experts that have both AI expertise in this instance, but also other forms of expertise, and come from the different regions that we're involving in the forum to ensure that these materials are accessible to people and that they will be easily digestible to the participants. So we develop these materials, and we actually ask them. We actually share with people what we plan to ask them as a part of the forum, so that they have an understanding. And so, for example, if the forum was on a menu for a restaurant, let's say, if an example would be, a question might be, what should I have for dinner tonight? And an example, a proposal may be, I should have a hamburger for dinner tonight. And there will be different competing trade-offs for having a hamburger, right? It may be tasty, but it might be not necessarily the healthiest choice. Another option might be, I want to have a salad tonight. And so there's different competing trade-offs there. We unpack all of those things for participants ahead of the forum so that they can read through it and understand not only the baseline information about, in this example, maybe nutrition or meal habits, but then also the questions and the proposals that we want them to think about with the competing trade-offs. We provide that to them ahead of the forum so that they can take a poll, and they provide initial feedback to us based on the questions. We then have the forum itself, where people enter Stanford's proprietary platform and are guided through a structured facilitation where they're invited to, broken up in small groups of 8 to 10 people. They're invited to share their reflections about the materials, share their reflections on their lived experience, and share their perspectives on the issues at hand. And then after they go through that process, they are provided an opportunity to engage in Q&A with experts. That's something we call the plenary session. But essentially, we recruit experts that are experienced in the field that the forum is focused on, and they engage with Q&A with the participants. The whole idea, again, is that they have this foundational experience, they've reflected on it, then they have access to a process to do question and answer. And then they're able to debrief on that experience with one another in small groups. And then they provide us feedback after the forum as well. And so what we end up getting from this forum operationally is we get really rich feedback that is both quantitative and qualitative in nature. So we have the surveys that these participants provide us before and after. So we're able to see what were their initial opinions coming into the forum and how might those have changed. But then also, because they're engaged in deliberation with one another, we have the transcripts of those deliberations. So we're able to understand the factors that maybe motivated some of those changes or the key things that came up in discussions that were really top of mind for people. And so taken all together, this is really rich considered feedback that not only allows us to understand where people want Meta to go, but also it helps us understand what are the factors that are really top of mind for people and what should we keep in mind as Meta as we innovate.
No, that's really great. And you very much laid out a very not too complicated, but relatively complex, very thorough and fascinating process, and contextualized it with that this is inspired by deliberative democracy ideas, which are both something that policymakers talk about a lot, and also political theorists, academics. You can really explore that from both a theoretical and a practical way. And one thing that kind of stuck out to me when I was reading through the different results of the different forums that you have held was the idea that, so just to back up a little bit, I was so excited because deliberative democracy is like one of those main fields in my research area in political theory. But then it's also a weird thing for me to talk about personally, because I would say a lot of my orientation on my own research is a little bit skeptical of some of deliberative democracy at the same time. And we can get into those parts of it. There's sort of always the limits of anything that we try to do when we try to figure out how to use opinion and how to counteract power relations when power is also at play in the way that opinions get expressed and understood. But just to zero in on something, what I appreciated was an analysis from the Stanford results from one of the first forums, I think, where they highlighted how in the future it would be good to have more opportunity for the participants to talk to the experts, to have their questions answered. And that what they highlighted wasn't just the informational element. So very much we can think of these deliberative processes as epistemic, that they allow us to get knowledge. People are getting educated. They're able to make more informed judgments about these kind of very potentially controversial ethical and political issue areas. And so there is this sort of emphasis on the knowledge that gets communicated. But there's also, I think, an emotional and affective element that when a person, before they get into the deliberation space with their other peers, if they get to actually ask whatever is bothering them, what they are confused about to the expert directly, just the idea that they're being kind of acknowledged and recognized in that way, and they have that standing in front of the group, I assume probably has some impact on their willingness and their comfort level to be in the deliberative process in the first place. So I guess I was thinking, is that something when you guys are thinking about how these forms are succeeding, do you think of it as primarily a sort of knowledge informational process, both a kind of a knowledge gathering, opinion, getting user feedback? Do you also think of it though in terms of kind of what it is doing for the larger community that's involved in terms of how they're thinking about these issues and how they see themselves in relation to the sort of the kind of broader technological space and also the company's decisions themselves?
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's something that we're always thinking about. I don't think that we will ever have settled on a forum model that we won't ever be tinkering with, if that makes sense, based on feedback. And that's what actually excites me. And I'd love to unpack some of your thoughts about deliberative democracy more broadly at some point. But it's something that I've really noticed as I have gone out and learned more about the deliberative democracy space, which is that the model has not been fully settled yet, and so there are still a lot of experimentations and different approaches unfolding. I think about the Belgian model or the model in the French speaking parliament in Belgium, where They actually involve members of parliament as a part of the small groups. Some people debate and say that that is an approach that's really helpful because participants have the opportunity to actually engage with the governing figures themselves. Others say that it's not effective because the members of parliament might take up too much space or might not be open to the deliberation. We have heard, from a number of different stakeholders and experts that having different types of modifications to the forum would be helpful and to generate even more legitimacy and buy-in. And I would just say we love the feedback and we are constantly kind of iterating. One of the pieces of feedback we heard about this very point that I'm hearing from you, which is engaging people in more than just kind of a education session where then they talk and provide survey feedback, but instead it's actually a give and take between the company and the participant, was from an expert who leads FIDE North America, Marjana Sassi, who urged me when she first met me that we need to close the loop with participants after we get the results. And so one of the interventions that we've designed in our latest community forum is actually contacting the participants after we release the results. So we hadn't done that in our earlier pilots, but in this latest iteration, we provided them a personalized note thanking them for their participation, explaining what the results meant, what we were doing with the results. And what we saw was it was a lot of enthusiastic feedback from the participants. And so these types of interventions to make it feel more personable, to create a process by which people feel like they're more involved in the decision-making process is really at the heart of what we're trying to do. At scale, right, when we have thousands of people participating, it may never feel highly personal, but we really want to try to create these types of interventions. And I know in Stanford's report from the Metaverse Community Forum, for example, they were talking about kind of a concierge service, and a process by which people who are more familiar with in-person gatherings can feel a little bit more comfortable and get training on platforms. So these are the types of process, context setting, but also other types of interventions that we're trying to create so that people feel like that they're more involved in a process rather than just some sort of webinar, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I think it does show that when we talk about deliberation, we aren't just talking about kind of information gathering or fact finding. It is something much larger and broader and deeper than that. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And I love hearing about the ways that you guys are kind of have learned over time and are further kind of changing and developing the processes in that direction too. Yeah. So then let's talk a little bit more about the substance of some of these forums. And I don't mind you taking the lead on what you would be most interested in discussing as we've kind of mentioned, and these are all available online. So I remember there's one pilot that you guys did on climate misinformation, another with Stanford on the metaverse, on harassment and bullying in the metaverse, and then the more recent one that we've talked a bit about already, which is generative AI. And so I think talking about the generative AI one, I think makes a lot of sense because it sounds like, as you said, so you did Brazil, Germany, Spain, and the United States in the most recent completed forum, but you'll be expanding that regionally. I'd like to hear more about what the plans are in the future, but for now, I'd love to dig in a little bit into some of the substance of what you guys ended up finding. What were users' opinions on different areas around Gen AI, and then maybe also thinking about, these are questions that are both forward thinking. It's proactive rather than reactive for the company, but it is also something where it's not just Meta that's working on these technologies. So I'd love to be able to talk about that more broadly too, to what degree you're comfortable with.
Oh, absolutely. That'd be great. So as you noted, all of these results are public. So you can go to either our website or Stanford's Deliberative Democracy Lab's website and access the full reports. As I mentioned, the kind of key tenets to anything we do as a team at Meta, and on the governance organization is rooted in representation, independence, an informed process, a transparent process, and consistent process. So the transparency piece is really key here for the community forum, where there's we want to make sure that we're not only publishing and showing a consistent process, but also the results are openly shared as well. And that's, I think, hopefully not only from a perspective where people can see the results and we're holding ourselves accountable to those results, but also it's part of this broader point that you made, which is there's so many people innovating these types of technologies, particularly AI. So why are we not? We should be sharing the results to benefit the broader AI ecosystem, not only our own governance of those technologies. And so on the substantive findings themselves, as you noted, we launched the first couple pilots were really about establishing a proof of concept and process, and we were thrilled with those pilots. And particularly the Metaverse Community Forum was what we understand to be one of the largest deliberative exercises in history. So it was involved, over 6,300 people across over 30 countries. And so that was really a proof of concept. And can you run a deliberation at scale? When we decided to do one on generative AI, given the speed that the technology was moving, we decided to move quickly and have a forum in a select number of countries, with the goal of expanding further, which, as I mentioned, that we are doing later this fall. But last year we had a forum in those 4 countries that you mentioned. So again, that was the US, Germany, Spain, and Brazil. And we chose those locations intentionally because the U.S. is where Meta's AI products were launched first, and then Europe is obviously kind of a key stakeholder where we see technologies rolling out, usually shortly after the U.S. And then Brazil, what we wanted to ensure was that we were being inclusive to developing nations, or the global majority. And indeed, that's where we're moving further in our next forum, which is deeper into developing nations and the global majority. But we wanted to ensure that we not only saw, where the AI products were being launched sooner, but also having a different mix of people or different communities that we thought may offer a diverse set of opinions. And so, what we were really thrilled by was the richness of the feedback and some of the kind of the key takeaways that we learned from the forum was that people actually were quite optimistic about the technology. That we see so much sensational discussion around things like job displacement or existential risk, all which are absolutely valid, and I never want to be dismissive of people's views. But what we saw was when provided the chance to really talk about the technology, learn about the technology, and engage it, what we saw was a shift from more sensational concerns to more recognition of some of the grounded risks around things like data privacy or data risks, et cetera. And so we thought it was really interesting to kind of see the transition of that particular discussion. But we also noted that consistently across the forum, what we saw was a lot of openness to the technology and a lot of willingness to engage the technology in a number of different ways, a belief that the technology would help productivity and creativity, that it actually could be a source of social connection for people who might be marginalized, but that there was a strong desire among the participants to have greater understanding of how the technology was developed, what AI was, or what a specific chatbot was designed to do, and to have some level of agency over that. So whether those are things like consents or user controls, et cetera, there was a lot of feedback around, I'm very open to this technology. I believe that it could be very useful to me, but I would like to understand more about it whenever I'm using it, and I would like to be able to control it and have some sort of control. And I think it really speaks to the fact that people are open to it if they just feel like they can that they retain some sort of agency over it.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And would you say that was something that was common across the regions, across the countries?
Yeah, the feedback, and maybe just also to step back for the audience, we really asked about principles that should underpin technology, and we asked a range of different principles. So things like what should be the principles that should underpin how a chatbot provides advice to people. So you think about this as an AI assistant and how it's sourcing its information and the types of responses that it's surfacing. We also asked a series of questions around how chatbots should foster connection with humans, and so things like how human-like a chatbot should be designed to be. And we provided examples of an transcripts of AI assistants versus some companion chatbots that people are using for social connection. And so we asked a series of questions about these types of topics, about the principles. And Kristen, to your question, we found that I think largely, right, there was some divergence across countries in terms of scale, but the directionally we found really unified responses, which we thought were really interesting. Was that people in certain markets, particularly Brazil, was a little bit of an outlier. And had a different scale of perspective in a lot of the results. But generally speaking, we got unified directional feedback around a willingness to engage with the technology, of a sense that it could be valuable, but a desire to have features that are incorporated that involve those transparency and control.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to dig into that a little bit, but I really appreciate how these forums are so forward looking, but then there's also a way in which a lot of the new issue areas that we're facing might echo things that we've already dealt with. I mean, not that we've dealt with in a resolved sense, but like there are patterns or dynamics online that are similar to what we're talking about here. And so let me just explain further what I'm talking about. So one of the questions that two sets of questions that your team asked was a part of this community forum was specifically that idea of chatbots treated more as companions or social connection. And so there were kind of two things there in terms of like, should there be boundaries around whether chatbots can kind of mimic and romantic or flirtatious types of interactions with users, and then also whether it would be okay for a user to use a chatbot to kind of help them pursue a romantic relationship with another human being. And what I thought was interesting about both of those was to the degree that people over time, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, were kind of open to the idea that that might be okay on either, or at least especially I'm thinking the one about like having these more social connections between the human user and the bot, as long as it's transparent that this is an artificial bot. And the sort of emphasis here is on that kind of transparency and consent. And it kind of struck me because of I don't know if I would say it's a 180, but what a major change our debates now are about LLMs and chatbots and the way they might be used for social connection versus, all the public debate and discussion we had some years ago around the Russian Internet Research Agency and the idea of troll farms and bots used to amplify misinformation online. And a lot of, I think, some of the concerns around those areas, those are different bots. Like, I'm not trying to say it's the same thing, but I think fundamentally at the heart of why ordinary users felt violated in some way by finding out about things like that online was because, they never know, am I interacting with another person who has this sincere belief, or am I interacting with a bot that's trying to get one over on me? I think people don't like being duped. We don't like being manipulated. And so I guess, when we're thinking about chatbots having these different roles in our social lives, are we rethinking the way we orient around, I don't know, a chatbot, or are we still kind of maintaining the same concerns we have ultimately about our own autonomy and our own authenticity and having kind of authentic relationships with others, being at least not being so wary of an artificial, I don't know. I'm very hesitant to say AI because I think sometimes it overstates what the technology does. But I think maybe we aren't so afraid of AI in a social way, but we still don't want to be manipulated or duped.
Yeah, I think to your point, it all boils down to authenticity and a sense of agency. So whether or not it's your understanding of communities on social media platforms or who you're engaging on social media platforms, or it's this sense of, there's a chatbot that is, I don't a chatbot that is highly persuasive, but I just want to confirm that it's a chatbot and what type of data it's storing about me because I'm offering it data, and I need to understand if I have control over that data. I think they kind of the core lesson there is really about authenticity verification and then some sort of agency over technology. And I think that that was one of these loud signals that we heard, which was, not a majority of people felt comfortable in the community forum about people using chatbots for romantic relationships, but about a third across the countries did. And I think that that's reflective of, maybe this is very new and might not necessarily feel appropriate to some people, but others might be open to it as long as there's these kind of interventions in place. And indeed, I think that parallels a lot of the information we've seen outside of Meta's community forum about chatbot services like Character AI and others that specialize in companion chatbots, where it is a smaller subset of people. It's not necessarily the amount of people that are using ChatGPT, but a smaller subset of people that are really engaging pretty intensely with these companion chatbots. And it's up to society to decide if ultimately they want to have a future where it's kind of like the movie Her. But I think what you pointed out is what we heard, which is that, regardless of where society is going, in order to feel like they have that choice and that agency to do so, that transparency, verification, authenticity is really kind of the key intervention for AI developers. And so that's what we took away from it.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense. And so, anyway, I would be interested in talking more about kind of future looking, seeing the differences. As you said, there was sort of common directionality between Brazil and the other countries, but still often kind of a major difference. I remember, if I'm remembering correctly, that Brazilian respondents were more interested in the idea of chatbots or AI being designed, informed by kind of local perspectives and local resources more so than more international perspectives. And so was that kind of part of the inspiration for your desire to implement forums more broadly across the global majority, as you put it?
Yeah, the desire is really to learn from lessons past about innovation, right? That so often innovation has been developed in homogenous communities. And so the idea is to be more inclusive and to, as we develop this new technology, to learn from past innovation cycles. And given the transformative effects that AI will undoubtedly have on so many different communities, and frankly, its innovative potential in different communities, we wanted to act quicker than in past innovations to engage the publics in this kind of meaningful way. But indeed, I think you're pointing to something with the Brazil results that is really instructive, which is we so much about our discourse about innovation is defined by a ecosystem, and it's around our immediate periphery. And so I think really pushing the boundaries and the types of feedback that we're getting, really structuring it in this deliberative and thoughtful way, will hopefully provide us that rich, considered feedback, but also open the aperture beyond the privileged few who have been part of those past innovation cycles, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so, will these future forums be asking the same sets of questions? Like, will be kind of attempting to kind of hold some of those variables constant, but get perspectives from other countries? Or
Yeah, it won't be the exact same questions. Some of them will be the same questions because some of these issues are enduring regardless. But the reality is the technology, as you know, has moved fast. So over the past year, it's developed quite a bit. So we will be updating some of the questions and then holding some of the questions constant. But it will be continue. We will continue to focus on the principles people want to see underpinning their AI experiences, and it will be across several different regions in October. So we're super thrilled about that, and we're really excited to see, how this feedback will continue to inform how we're developing the technology.
Great. And so kind of zooming out a little bit here, how do you see what your team is doing with these forums and how you're approaching these governance questions, fitting into the broader landscape of what other companies are doing or what a company might do to get user feedback and incorporate user perspectives into its policies?
Yeah, just like I mentioned, that there doesn't seem to be there's this really rich ecosystem for deliberative democracy that's happening, the so-called deliberative wave that is taking root, and these really interesting different models of mini publics and citizens assemblies that are taking hold. We're also seeing that play out in across AI companies and platforms. And we have been so inspired watching some of the other experiments and pilots that are ongoing. So OpenAI has delved into this and actually had a grant program, as well as shared a little bit publicly about it, how there was public input into its model spec, something that it released earlier this year. And then last year, Anthropic had run an experiment using collective response technology, something called the collective constitutional AI. And so these are experiments and pilots that we have been really fascinated to watch. But I think it's all a part of a broader story of companies and labs trying to get ahead of what we know could be a very is has a technology that has a lot of promise, but also a lot of potentially unforeseen consequences. And so we recognize that there's been these calls for more. Some people call it the democratization of input into AI, but generally seeking feedback in real ways from the public, representative samples of the public. And I think a lot about Edelman's annual trust barometer, which is a survey of the global public that I read closely every year. But this year's Edelman Trust Barometer focused on, or was titled, "Innovation in Peril," and talked all about how emerging technologies and innovations need to be developed with the public's input. And I found that to be really convincing to show that in order for these technologies, which will have such impacts on society, we need to be involving the public as a part of that decision making process. And so I do think that Meta, we're taking steps, and we're so excited about our community forums, and we've been really interested to see the other experiments that are happening across the industry. And I do think that we'll continue to innovate further based on all of these lessons, whether it's the community forums or these other pilots that we're seeing from actors like OpenAI and Anthropic. We will continue to learn lessons and hopefully share our lessons, and then also adapt further.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I hope you don't mind then if we dig a little bit into I appreciated that idea, this idea. I didn't know about this trust barometer, and the idea of technologies needing to be developed with the public's input. I guess one limitation or one concern I have about some of the deliberative democracy frameworks, and I understand, it's very I would never I don't have the expertise on this that necessarily those at the Deliberative Democracy Lab have, and I don't think that necessarily what you guys are doing reflect this problem. But when we think about it in a broader political sense, one I think concern might be, if you think about the typical town hall and you think about local governance, things like zoning regulations, for example, a lot of times the people and members of a community who have the time to show up to one of those types of assemblies are people who are a little bit wealthier, who have more free time on their hands. And so I think some critics might suggest that though the attempt to get more kind of on the ground feedback from the public is important and can kind of be a check on other forms of political power in a political system, there might be some ways in which kind of other forms of social and economic power end up being kind of embedded into that process as well. And again, like I said, I don't think that those are problems that we can always figure out a way around and that we can solve. It's just then how do we know that the decisions that are being made aren't being in some way skewed by those patterns of power?
Yeah. I think it's a great point, and something that I know that there's much discussion about in the deliberative democracy space. Brilliant mind in this space, Ali Sarone, who's at the London School of Economics, is focusing a lot of her research on selection bias, right? That if are certain people more predisposed to want to participate in these processes, and therefore does that skew the results of these processes? Because people who are who may not want to participate are self-selecting out, and then therefore you're getting a biased sample towards democratic participation or a certain type of policy, et cetera. So I think that that is a super interesting area to continue to explore. In terms of access, it seems like that's also kind of a key issue for the deliberative democracy space, because if you are for example, if you're participating in an in-person citizens assembly, you might need to leave your family for a weekend to go participate. So we have leveraged a best practice from the experts and practitioners that we have learned from, which is, we will work with the Deliberative Democracy Lab to provide laptops or other means of connectivity to people if they don't have connectivity when we're trying to get a representative sample. We also sponsor childcare stipends. People need childcare, so we do, as a part of these tenets that I mentioned: representation, independence, informed, consistent, and transparent. We are, in order to achieve representation, we're trying to drive down the barriers to entry as much as we possibly can. But what that doesn't necessarily do is correct for the selection bias issue. That seems like it's a broader issue that I don't know all the literature on it, but is implicating the entire space, which is some people who don't want to participate may just opt out of any type of opportunity.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. That makes a lot of sense to me. And like I said, I don't think that acknowledging these limits is necessarily, it's not any of these critiques. They're not fatal. It's just kind of always negotiating the different kind of limitations of the different practices and processes that we adopt, and trying to develop and incorporate and think about, rethink different decision making processes.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right, and the I'm inspired in so many ways because I see the diversity of models that are springing up in deliberative democracy, and it makes me excited to learn what is working and what is not working, and then adjust our approach accordingly. So some deliberative democracy experts have told us that, for example, unless you try to drive participants towards consensus through a convergent phase at the end of the community forums, that's not really deliberative democracy. I've had others say that you can't have online deliberation, that doesn't constitute deliberation. And I love all the feedback because, as you know, my North Star is, that I'm laser focused on these elements of legitimacy, representation, independence, informed, transparent, and consistent. But short of that, I mean, I think making sure that we are being open to modifying our approach based on feedback, but also based on watching what else is happening in the space, that is really what inspires me. And I don't think that the book is finished on what effective deliberative democratic inputs into either governments or companies will really look like. And it's just kind of it's exciting to be a part of the process, and we're just really looking forward to learning more and trying to harness the power that people learn from. I actually had the opportunity to also observe a community forum in Kosovo, or excuse me, not a community forum, a citizens assembly in Kosovo. And that was my first time seeing an in-person deliberation in a truly kind of traditional way. And I walked away with tons of different learnings about how we can structure our community forums and improve it. But I think you're right in kind of pointing to real limitations based on kind of necessary trade-offs and constraints. And so for us, we think a lot about wanting technology to be a part of the solution, even if that, doing it at scale and having so many different participants may impede kind of a convergent phase towards recommendations, for example.
Yeah, yeah, and actually, I think it's one of the scholars that is influential in our programs, or that we read often in our fellowships, is Eleanor Ostrom, and she and some of her later work was having kind of these new having a second generation model of rationality, which was also about kind of how our sociability as people. And one of the things that she was exploring that was late in her career, and she's since passed, was how people cooperate and how often kind of being in person and body language and reciprocity, these repeated games like enable people to cooperate. And they were not finding as much of that cooperation via computer mediated, but these were sort of old school terminals. And what I think is really interesting, so I think I used to be quite skeptical of online deliberation, but I actually think to some of the points that we were talking about before, there's some ways in which, like you said, there's trade-offs and there's some advantages to it, being able to have such a large group of people, being able to be, there are plenty of people who might self-select out because they're not interested, but there might be people who are just self-selecting because they can't do it. And so by making it accessible, are going to have people who otherwise wouldn't necessarily be in those in-person meetings either, which I think is helpful too. And I would just say, again, as somebody who, as I was saying, I'm a little bit lean on the skeptical side of some of the deliberative democracy arguments. And this is, again, what we're talking about political theory is sometimes different from what we're talking about here. But I would say that I think that a lot of what politics is about managing disagreement and being okay with disagreement and developing toleration and ways of allowing for disagreement. So I don't think it's always necessarily a bad thing. I do recognize, if we're making decisions that have huge impacts, you want as much agreement as possible. But I also think maybe it's a reason to be thinking about things like flexibility and adaptability that allows for different types of people with different preferences to be satisfied. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if there's a trade-off where you're getting more people into a conversation without necessarily getting the convergence.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it also, it may depend on the purpose of what you're looking to achieve. So as you mentioned, maybe a certain policy issue you're really trying to drive towards some sort of set of recommendations. For other circumstances, maybe you don't need to. I'm sure that there are probably some theorists that feel strongly about one approach over the other. But I think it's really about what you're trying to index around and focus on. And it's kind of why I go back to the core tenets for a legitimate process that I'm so laser focused on, and that I think maximizing flexibility and openness to innovation will be helpful, particularly for a company like Meta, where no one has really done this before, but really being focused on partnering with an independent organization like Stanford and optimizing towards a consistent, transparent process, and being open to watching where the field is moving more broadly, given that there's so many different experiments going on.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I think I am not sure if there's there's so much more that we could talk about. Is there anything we didn't get a chance to talk about that you were hoping to share with us today?
So such a rich discussion, and I hope I hope that it's one that can serve as a helpful basis and jumping off point to a range of different discussions around not only technology governance but corporate governance, to how deliberative democracy is continuing to grow. And hopefully, my hope is that Meta's involvement in this space can be constructive to the overall development of this ecosystem, not only amongst technology companies, but indeed the broader deliberative democracy community writ large.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today, Kris. It was such a pleasure to learn from you, and I'm so excited to share your perspective with our audience. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and best of luck.
I'm so grateful that Kris took the time to talk to us about his work with the governance team at Meta. It can be really rare to have this type of candid conversation with a representative of a private company, particularly one that is in the news as much and as influential in our daily lives as Meta. I also really appreciated the way that Kris described the kind of work that he and his team do at Meta, which seems very unique to me. And that is that they evaluate the systems and power dynamics between users and the company with a goal of empowering users. We talked about one of these community forums on generative AI. This was implemented in October 2023 and was concerning what kinds of principles should guide generative AI's engagement with users. Some questions concerned what were the kinds of sources that chatbots should draw from, whether chatbots should reflect local or national values and perspectives from the users' communities, and if so, whether those should still be informed by respect for human rights and marginalized groups. These types of forums are an iterative process. Meta learns from one and implements these lessons in another. So given that important question of multiculturalism and whether and how to incorporate different cultural and political perspectives, they have been working to provide the forums to different countries beyond the initial 4. You can read more about this forum and others on Meta's website, as well as the websites of their partners, Stanford University's Deliberative Democracy Lab and the Behavioral Insights team. We'll provide links to those in the show notes. The governance team also shares the results of their forums and solicits feedback from outside scholars and experts. Kris mentioned how, in response to feedback provided by Marjan Asasi, Executive Director at the Federation for Innovation and Democracy North America, the team started directly following up with the participants of the forums to explain the results and to explain what Meta was actually doing with the results. I think this part of the process is really important to the goals of creating trust and legitimacy with users, as it helps illustrate to the participants that all their efforts were not in vain, that they were taken seriously, and they have the genuine potential to actually inform work made at the company. Deliberative democracy is a very influential theoretical concept in political science, and it has influenced a lot of political institutions around the world, as Kris notes. But whether an institution, a company, a country effectively incorporates a given individual's or community's preferences into a decision ultimately has more to do with who has control over the design and implementation of any given policy. Due to the organizational structure of Meta, for example, executive leadership has significant authority over many policies that govern the workplace itself and its platforms. Much of the episode focuses on the challenges in facilitating high-quality and inclusive processes of democratic deliberation on issues that are highly technical, ethically fraught, and culturally contingent. I want to underscore just how grateful I am to have learned a lot from Kris and to be able to share his insights and the expertise of his entire team with all of you. But to be candid, if we were having this conversation today, I would have focused a lot more on this question. How do we enable processes of democratic deliberation have teeth and actually influence those who have the power to make policy decisions, whether we're talking about a country or a company? The thing is, this question is a really big one, and I'm hoping we can confront it more directly in future conversations on this podcast. The design of the Oversight Board is just one example of how a structural design can help provide an actual check on power, insofar as it is a third-party institution that Meta cannot control, and its decisions, at least with regard to specific cases, are actually binding on Meta as long as they don't violate the law. But even in the absence of institutional design that democratizes or decentralizes power, an organization, whether public or private, can do things like publicly justify policy decisions that can try to facilitate trust and a sense of legitimacy among the public. To illustrate this, I'll do a little bit of a political theory reading of Meta's January 7 announcement regarding their changes to their fact-checking and content moderation policies. I'll treat this like a governing document, something that is not just a PR announcement, but something that is trying to instill trust and legitimacy in a broad public audience that possesses an extremely wide range of political and moral beliefs. So, because there's such a wide disagreement, I think something that's really important is to robustly back up any policy decision with strong evidence that not only a given policy problem exists and that the audience should care about it, but that the policy being implemented will effectively address the problem and have the desired results stated in the document. So I'm focusing heavily on the text, the January 7 announcement, which is on Meta's website and we'll cite in the show notes. Something that stands out to me right away is that for a company whose business relies heavily on data concerning click-through rates and engagement, there's surprisingly little statistics or data given to back up both the diagnosis of problems that they want to address and why their proposed solutions will be effective. So credit given where credit's due, they do share, in my view at least, a relatively concerning statistic about the percentage of content removals which may have been mistakes, content that didn't actually violate their moderation policies. But they only give this for 1 month
of last year, December 2024. It'd be interesting to know how much this has changed over time, whether these changes seem to be depending on different policy decisions made in the past that are being undone, for example. Additionally, while the document promises to expand Meta's transparency reporting, the announcement doesn't actually draw on the many reports they already publish on their transparency website. A reader is compelled to wonder what data isn't being highlighted and whether the data that exists supports or contradicts the policy changes. So, for example, it's striking to me that even though the company has invested in things that seek user feedback like the Oversight Board and the community forums, these were not cited in the announcement either. When organizations provide public justifications for their actions, it may seem like cheap talk if they are not robustly supported. And whatever motivations or principles are stated may not actually be trusted by readers if they see other conditions or circumstances that they think may actually be part of it as well. So, for example, given what we know about President Trump's governing style, both from his first term and from his announcements before and now since his inauguration, we know that he is committed to a very personalistic and heavily centralized governing style. So a lot of public discourse around the announcements has been whether these changes were less about users or even clients, but pleasing the president and seeking either regulatory favors or avoiding arbitrary penalties. Just to do a plug for the kind of work that we talk about in our fellowships, this is really relevant to debates around public choice theory and the extent to which companies pursue rent-seeking in this type of environment, especially where they see they might be able to get rewards or be penalized by authorities. Whether we're talking about a company or the American government, all of this is really just a reminder that I wanted to share that how executive power is wielded or constrained is absolutely crucial to any kind of mitigation of power and to the development of trust and legitimacy, as well as having any kind of hope of an actually democratic form of governance. As someone who likes to escape into historical rabbit holes, it's always a thrill, if a little challenging, to have an episode like this that covers topics that are fast-moving. I just wanted to reiterate my thanks to Kris Rose and the governance team at Meta for providing their incredible insights. And thank you all for listening to this first episode of our third season. I'm so excited to be back talking to you. Later in the season, we'll be talking to Dr. Alice Hsu, Associate Director at Stanford University's Deliberative Democracy Lab, who worked with Meta on these community forums and has an incredible array of experience with other institutions as well that are interested in deliberative processes. I think it gives us a nice hope about the future of democracy. Talking to Alice, I really enjoyed that conversation. So if you enjoyed this one, then please keep your ear out for that one as well. Thanks again for listening. Till next time.